which seemed a little bit out of, I don't know, like order. He mentions the 7, right? I think it's recording, yeah. And then goes to the single angel and then goes back to the 7, which then present the trumpets. So I'll be reading Uriah Smith. That's like the earliest kind of understanding. I'm sure some details have changed in that, but it's what I was able to find. So that's what I'll be sharing now. And again, if anyone has any other sort of information that you've read, feel free to present it. But let's read this first. So this is from Uriah Smith's Daniel and Revelation book. It was really popular for a long time, right? Until kind of new ideas and new understandings of the Bible, were studied. But let me read this. This is specifically about those verses that we read last week. So it says this: the verse introduces a new and distinct series of events. In the seals, we have had the history of the church during what is called the Christian era. In the 7 trumpets now introduced, we have the principal political and warlike events that occur during the same time. So according to Uriah Smith, the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets follow kind of the same timeline, the same beginning and the same end, just different perspectives. The seals more about the Christian era, what's going on around Christianity, while the trumpets are going to be more political and wars and the kind of the struggles during the same time period. So that's what he presents. And then he goes on and says this: but why are these verses inserted here? So this is talking about that angel that appears with the censer, and he throws it on the earth and stuff. So this is what Uriah Smith understood. They are a message of hope and comfort for the church. The 7 angels with their warlike trumpets have been introduced. Terrible scenes were to take place when they should sound. But before they should begin to blow, the people of God are directed to behold the work of mediation in heaven, mediation in their behalf in heaven, and to look to their source of help and strength during this time. Though they should be tossed upon the tumultuous waves of strife and war, they were to know that their great high priest still ministered for them in the sanctuary in heaven. To that sacred place they could direct their prayers with the assurance that they would be offered with incense to their Father in heaven. Thus could they gain strength and support in their tribulation. So it's an interesting interpretation. It's an interesting way that he explains it. So basically, these 7 trumpets are kind of devastating, right? They're not gentle. They're very strong in their messages. And so he points out that, this might be God just reminding them, yes, bad times are going to come, but you can pray and your prayers are being heard by God. So there's like a comfort there, right? This promise there that, during these hard times, we're not alone, right? We're not powerless. We're not without God. So it's, go ahead, Judy. Go ahead.
Magnifying glass for it, please. It's on the table.
Oh, talking to someone else. It's a good explanation. I don't know if there's anything else. Did anyone read anything? Did anyone kind of look up anything in terms of these kind of little in-between verses? This is just before we go into the actual first trumpet.
Yeah. Well, I know if you were to read from like Marvin Maxwell and even some of the later writers like Pauline or even Stefanovic, they use the trumpets to show God's retribution on those who have disregarded the warnings. Like, for example, the first one, they say it's because of Jerusalem was destroyed because
the rejection of Christ,
a form of judgment.
Yeah.
But the thing about Uriah Smith first 4 trumpets deal with the destruction of Rome and only Rome by the barbarian tribes, 4 barbarian tribes.
That
would destroy Rome. But more currently, the writers are thinking that, it doesn't have to all do with Rome. So people like Maxwell, who wrote in the or the mid to the late 20th century,
Yeah.
he looked at the first trumpet and he says that was the destruction of Jerusalem because they rejected Christ, and all he did, they put him on the cross, and this was retribution for them.
Yeah.
And like the second one, it's retribution for Rome because of Rome destroying, taking the life of Christ, and so on and so forth. And they go down the line. The third one is a church. So they vary from Uriah Smith.
Yeah.
Vast difference between it.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the most recent, like Tungstad, who was written published his Revelation just last year.
Mm-hmm.
He says they're all the working of demons, and he used that because he talked about the last two trumpets. Well, at least the fifth and the sixth trumpet, where they regard them as the movement of Islam, like Marvin Maxwell. He says they're strictly demons because of the kind of caricature of these things coming to the smoke, and the changing to serpents and horses and horse heads and tails and the heads, So when we go through that, you'll see the various changes. He says they're strictly, we're dealing with demons here. And in the fifth trumpet, you have this angel that was kicked out on the third trumpet. He is also figured in the fifth, and he is the one leading all of these, or whatever it is, if they're demons or followers of Islam. But according to him, these are demons, and you have the prince or the king of the demons called Abaddon or Apollyon, and both languages, Hebrew and Greek, it means the destroyer. And the destroyer is the one who's opened the key to the bottomless pit. So he says that in itself establishes that Lucifer, the accuser or the slanderer, is the one really doing most of these things. And God is trying to warn us and reveal to us what is to come. So God is not the one providing retribution or creating this retribution. The devil is doing it. And he is putting the blame on God, as though God is doing these things. And it's fascinating the way he writes in this.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard that one yet, so that's an interesting one. We'll have to get that perspective as we go through each of the seven, for sure. All right, let's jump right into the first one then, since we've already kind of mentioned it. Let's get Venus in here. Give me a second. There we go. Does someone want to read this? So this is, I think it's Revelation 8, right? I don't think it's 7.
Yeah, 8.
Yeah,
yes.
it's 8. I didn't change the title there. So we're reading Revelation 8, so don't get confused. Revelation 8 and verse 7. Does someone want to read this one? This is the first trumpet.
The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up.
All right, so we have three main things being presented here. The first one is like the weapon, right? Which in this case is hail and fire mingled with blood, right? So that's the thing that's falling. Oh, I lost my face here. I don't know why. Give me a second. Let me try plugging it in somewhere else. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that it destroys a third, right? Which is kind of an interesting little thing there. It doesn't destroy everything. It destroys a third. And then what's actually being destroyed, right? So in this case, it's all green grass was burned up and the trees, right? So hail and fire mixed with blood. We'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the third, and then we'll talk about what the trees and the green grass represents. Now, before we go into, what all the professionals talk about, let's see what the Bible says about these things. All right, so let's look at the Bible first. This is one of the few verses in the Bible where you get all three words together. So hail, fire, and blood. All right. Um, Oddly enough, we find it in Ezekiel. We know that this is a book that connects with Revelation quite a bit. Does someone want to read this? This is verses 18 to 23.
Chapter 38.
Ezekiel 38, 18 to 23.
Okay, and it will come to pass at the same time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face, and I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I'll be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord.
All right, so in this context, now it's not exactly the same. It has some similarities, but it's not exactly the same. You do get the hailstones, you get the fire, talks about the bloodshed, though it also mentions something like pestilence and flooding rain and things like that. In this case, this is God's judgment on Gog. Now, this is a place that will actually come up in the Bible where it talks about Gog and Magog, which, to be honest, I've never understood. I've tried studying it. I don't know. I just know it was a city that was against God in the Old Testament. I don't know anything else beside that. But this is one case where we have a similarity. Fire and hail, we also know that appears in the plagues of Egypt, right? We know that God sends down the hail where it's mixed with blood, and it destroys a lot. Um, Now, is there anything else in terms of the hail and fire mingled with blood, what that can possibly mean? Any ideas before we get to the next two parts?
Well, I know that there is the hail and blood. God talks about using some of these elements as a form of judgment. But it is strange when you look at some of the writings in, like, for example, the book of Ezekiel, the early part, when God warned that he would bring punishment on the Jews, Israel at the time, because of the way they have been dishonoring him, worshiping stones and images and so on and so forth. And although the prophet says God will do these things, God did not create those things. As a matter of fact, all the destructions came through Babylon, who was allowed to come and conquer the land. Okay? So many times the prophet will say God will do these things, but God is not creating these retribution or these judgment the way we read them very often. And I mean, if you go to Ezekiel from chapter 2 way down to around 10, 11,
Absolutely.
it is a prediction
Yeah.
that these are things will happen, but the Babylonians will be coming into Israel and they will do the actual destruction.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, and again, we have to read and look carefully as how these things are written, because as one writer says, many of these things that are occurring give God a bad name.
Yeah.
Why most people believe the Old Testament, the God in the Old Testament is not a very kind and compassionate God. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason I even showed Ezekiel is because it's the only verse that I can actually find all three words together. There are a few other verses where you get hail and fire mixed together, but it's very rare, and it's always connected to some sort of like judgment and things like that. Let me check the chat here for a second. So First Chronicles 5:4. So this is talking about Gog. So we'll get into that into the future, but Gog is identified as a descendant of the prophet Joel in Ezekiel 38:39. He is the chief prince of the tribes of Meshech and Tubal in the land of Magog, who is called upon God to conquer the land of Israel. Yeah, so that's as much as I have too. We know it's a real place. We know it was, or Magog was a real place. Gog was a real king. But it appears in Revelation just out of the blue. Why it appears in Revelation, that's where I don't have a good answer. I've never heard a good answer, anyways. But when we get there, maybe we'll be able to figure something out. So yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't mean that this is God doing it. It could simply be God warning us that these events are going to happen, right? That these things will happen upon the earth. Let's get to the next section then. So the idea of the third. So this is another one that I went through the Bible and looked at all the verses where you look at a third of something, right? So not a third day or anything like that, but a third of something. So these are the verses that are found in the Bible, just to give us a little bit of context. This is 2 Samuel 18, verses 1 and 2. It says this, and David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I will also surely go out with you myself. So David used it to just, not randomly, but to organize his people. He set them up into thirds, all right? In another verse, 2 Kings 11, which is repeated in 2 Chronicles 23, you get a very similar thing, except this time with the people kind of in God's house. So it says, in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of hundreds of the bodyguards of the escorts and brought them into the house of the Lord to him. And he made a covenant with them and took an oath from them in the house of the Lord and showed them to the king's son. Then he commanded them, saying, this is what you shall do. 1/3 of you who come on duty on the Sabbath shall be keeping watch over the king's house. 1/3 shall be at the gate of Sur, and 1/3 at the gate behind the escorts. You shall keep the watch of the house, lest it be broken down. And it's repeated again, same story in 2 Chronicles. So for a second time, it's again the idea of thirds is used in organizing or dividing the people. All right. In Ezekiel 5, it gets a lot more, prophetic. And so this one seems to connect a lot more with what we read in Revelation. So let me read this here. This is Ezekiel 5, 1 and 2. And you, son of man, take a sharp sword, take it as a barber's razor, and pass it over your head and your beard. Then take scales to weigh and divide the hair. You shall burn with fire 1/3 in the midst of the city. Then when the days of the siege are finished, then you shall take 1/3 and strike it with the sword, and 1/3 you shall scatter in the wind. I will draw out a sword after them. So when you look at the context of this is kind of God's judgment on these people here. So 1/3 die by fire, 1/3 die by sword there in the city, 1/3 kind of run off into the hills, but the sword goes after them and destroys them. All right. So again, this is another aspect of judgment, of things that will happen in the future. You can see a lot more connection here. But again, the idea of a third is used, just that very simplified 3 groups. In verse 11, you get a similar thing again. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with your detestable things and with your abominations, therefore I will diminish you. My eyes will not spare, nor will I have pity. 1/3 of you shall die of the pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst, and 1/3 shall fall by the sword all around you, and I will scatter another third to the winds, and I will draw out the sword after them. So this is the explanation of the whole dividing of the hair. All right. Zechariah 13, we get another reading of the thirds. And it shall come to pass in the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 in it shall be cut off and die, but 1/3 shall be left in it. I will bring 1/3 through the fire, will refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. They will call my name, and I will answer them. I will say, this is my people, and each one will say, the Lord is my God. So what you seem to be seeing here is God likes thirds, right? He likes dividing the people that way. The judgments are told that way. And in this case, it's talking about judgment and the salvation of the remnant. But again, always using that idea of thirds. When we talk about something like Ezekiel and Zechariah, we I guess the question is it literally a third, or is it simply kind of a very generalized, the three main things are going to happen. One group is going to suffer this, one group is going to suffer that, one group is going to go through that.
I think it will have to be, sorry, Pastor, I think it will
Yeah.
have to be the latter, because each one talks about a third, a third, a third, and you only have 3/3 in a whole, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But that's the idea. Like everyone is going to pass through something, but you're going to fall into one of three groups, right? There seems to always be kind of three groups presented. And of course, if we go to Revelation, we get the most famous third, which is from Satan, right? His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven, threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour the child as soon as it was born. So even when we talk about what happened in heaven, we get this very clean, 2/3 remained with God, 1/3 went down with Satan, right? Again, is that a perfectly precise number? Probably not. Otherwise it has to get down to that one angel, right, to literally divide it. But it could just simply be a more generalized, the larger group stayed with God and a smaller group fell down to earth. So it really depends on how you want to see it. The Bible does say a third. So if you want to take it as literal, then it's a third, right? 2/3 stayed in heaven, 1/3 stayed with the devil, and the same thing with the other verses as well. All right. And this is another place where we see this third. In fact, it's going to happen, I believe, a few times within the trumpets, this idea of the third. Any ideas from anyone else? Maybe something that you've read or noticed throughout the Bible, what the idea of the third might represent?
Well, if we take, for example, Maxwell, he talks about a third of the people were destroyed because the mention here, the first angel sounded. We're looking at the symbolism of trees and green grass, and those represented God's people. Mm-hmm. According to, you could go back to the Bible and look at those. Yeah. So he suggests that the first trumpet was judgment on Israel, as I mentioned before, because they've rejected Christ, prefer Caesar than God, Christ. And this is God bringing judgment upon them, and this is the first trumpet. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I noticed, well, that has been what has been held by most of the writers like Maxwell, Stefanovic, and Pauline.
Yeah, that was the big one anyways. Yeah. Most people, I think, would follow with that one, yeah.
Yeah, but this Tungstad looked at this and he said, you mentioned about a third of the angels that was drawn in Revelation 12. And he says that third is very symbolic. Mm-hmm. And the symbolism of it is that the third that we're seeing in the trumpets really refer to the third that we find in Revelation 12. That is, that these are demons who are in charge of doing the work in these trumpets. And the third is symbolic of the work of the demons.
It's like a representation,
right, of the third of, So So the point is, we know who are doing the destructive things in the first, second, and third trumpets. So
Now, does Tungsten still believe that it represents Israel, Rome, and I think it's
no, he doesn't.
variants?
He
So
doesn't.
how does he explain the first one then?
Well, very broad. These are demons are working, and there are two things he's looking at. He says one is much of what we're seeing here is retribution. Many of us believe God is doing this, and he says it is not. It is the devil and the demons are doing this, and God is only permitting based on his own wisdom. Why he does it, we really don't know, but God is permitting. And the demons and the devil are committing these acts, okay? And that's the view he looks at, because he says the book of Revelation, looking at the macro view of it,
Yeah.
is that God is not the one who is bringing about this retribution, but he's the one who is the revealer.
He's simply revealing what's going to happen,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
So we talk about the open door, the openness, of God. He called John up to heaven and so on and so forth. So he's very open, and he is the revealer. Of course, he presented the book of Revelation so we can understand based on what he's revealing. And at the same time, there's a power trying to bring about all this retribution. He's permitting it, but he is not the one doing it, but God is allowing these things to happen.
All right, that's good. I've never gotten deep into that perspective, so it's good to hear. All right, I do actually have some verses that talk about trees and grass and what they can represent. So let me quickly go through those verses here. Actually, Revelation 9 is probably the best one that explains it. I might have just kept it with this verse. So let me read this here. This is jumping ahead, but it's a good explanation. Revelation 9, verse 4. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree. All right. So this is something attacking green grass, green things, and trees. But within the same verse, it actually explains what these three things actually are. But only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. All right. So this verse becomes really important, because inadvertently it's telling us what the trees and the green grass and the green things represent. Basically, it represents men who do have the seal of God on their foreheads, or men who are kind of supposed to be the children of God, right? So it's verse 4 makes it very clear that yes, when we read, let me go back here. When we read about this first trumpet, it's not destruction of literal trees and grass, and so it's not forest fires or whatever going on. Chapter 9 verse 4 shows us so what's being destroyed here are people. All right. And if the symbolism of this verse is similar to the one of chapter 8, that would mean that grass, green things, and trees are the opposite of men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads, which would then be those that do have the seal, right? Those that are children of God. But when you read through the Bible, the Psalms has a lot of verses talking about this, right? We are trees planted by the river, and so on. There's quite a few verses that make that connection between kind of the children of God and living trees, right? Planted by rivers and so on. So that's where, at least traditionally speaking, a lot of the people that explain the trumpets push this towards, in this case, it would be the Jews, right? So if you look at Maxwell and the rest, in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, they in general suggest that this is, again, that retribution, right? That judgment that's talked about back in like Daniel's day, where it says, I'm giving so many years for the Jews, right? After that, they're not my special people anymore. They lose that protection. So again, even when you take Daniel, for instance, the idea is that they lose the protection from God. It's not that God is going to punish them. It's not that God is, you rejected Jesus, so now you're going to pay for it. No, it's simply, I'm going to protect you as my special children until the day that you just completely reject me, at which point that bubble, that protection that I have against you from the devil, from his angels, will be taken away. That's why, Ken, I was asking if he still believed that this would be like the Jews or whatever, because it still works, right? Um, if these do represent the Jews, then again, this isn't God doing it, but he's simply, because he's taken away his protection, this is the consequence, right? The devil attacks, God's first children, right? The Jews. So I know like Stefanovic and Maxwell and Paul Stina, all of those guys, they usually talk about that. Um, do you want to explain a little bit more, maybe what Tungsten says about this one, Ken, if you know?
Yeah, well, he believes that, for example, he doesn't tie down specific time periods, because he says, for example, if you look at seals, talks about wars and famine and death. He says that has been going on all along from the beginning of time. And there's nothing specific that says these are things that happen at a specific period.
So it's not
But we do
chronological.
know, we do tie in those periods, because if we take the beginning of those prophecies from 100 AD, we can pick specific spots in history and the tragedy that has occurred.
Yeah.
And most of those are done. But he believes that these are general broad issues
Okay,
that is
okay,
going
okay.
on and have been going on all the time. Okay. One of the interesting things that you just showed in Revelation 9:4, notice it says he commanded, or they were commanded.
Yeah,
So there's somebody in charge
yeah,
who is saying you can only do such and such. And it brings us back to the book of Job, where God says to the devil, okay, you can do whatever you want, but don't touch him, or don't take his life. So again, it gives the impression that although God is in charge, but only to such length he would permit the devil or the demons to go. He's saying, okay, you can destroy these, but don't touch these who are sealed or my people. And so again, this brings out this idea that God is the one in charge. And even though he's not mentioned, because they were commanded, who was commanded? It is not mentioned. But reading this and reading the other texts, you find that God is saying, okay, don't do this.
This is
And
the
we have
limit.
lots of references. You could go back to Job, or you go back to several other books, and you see the same thing.
Yeah.
So
All right.
that is
So
really comforting.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So let's wrap up with the two big ideas then, the two main theories that are going on now. So the
Can I-
older one. Go ahead, Judy. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question before? So
For sure.
the grass and the trees of 8 are different to the grass and the trees of 9?
So we're reading Revelation 8, right?
Yeah.
Which is part of the trumpets. In Revelation, we haven't gone there yet, but that's a good question. I still think it in general represents God's people. Um, so well, let me explain the two sides, and then you can decide for yourself, Judy. So the earlier, the traditional view is that the seven trumpets were chronological, right? Which would and that the seals were also chronological, and they actually followed the same chronology of the churches, right? So there was this general kind of connection between the churches, the seals, and the trumpets. If you follow that belief, if that's kind of how you see this, then this would be similar to the early church, and it would be similar to the first seal, right? Which is that expansion of Christianity out, and the Jews kind of being left behind, right? There's this God is kind of stepping away from the Jews and now focusing on the world, right, in Christianity. So what this would be then in the traditional view is, I was with the Jews, right? In Daniel, I'm going to give you so many years. If you do not accept the Messiah, right? If you don't come back to me, then you're no longer my special people, and I'm going to focus on the whole world. Which would mean that it kind of opens the door for the devil to attack Israel, right? To attack the Jews, because now they don't have that special protection that God has had on them in the past, right? So then this would be that attack on them. Now they don't all die, it's a third, and that's usually how they see the third in the traditional sense. So not all of the Jews were done away with, but a good chunk of them, right? And this is where we get the idea of them being persecuted and spread out and things like that. So that's the traditional view. This newer view, which I find really interesting, I haven't heard this one before, is that the seals and that the trumpets aren't necessarily chronological. These are simply 7 different things that will occur during the whole time period, right? So from John's day until the second coming, these 7 general events are going to be happening throughout the earth. So if we take the seals, for instance, there's going to be famines throughout that time period. There's going to be wars throughout that time period. There's going to be pestilences throughout that time period. In this case, now you can tell me if I'm wrong, but does he still see the trees and the grass as God's people? Or is this...
Well, we have gone through these, and there's a lot of references to the trees and the grass as God's people.
Okay.
For example, the Revelation 9:4 says they've been sealed. So we know these are God's people.
Okay.
But he
So
doesn't
this
go
would be
into
persecution that kind of goes throughout history?
yeah.
Yeah, so it's not
But he
necessarily
doesn't go
talking
in this
about the
specific
Jews.
period. He doesn't take periods.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he takes a kind of macro view, and his focus is really on the book of Revelation is God revealing what is to come. And at the same time, the retribution, or what we call the judgment, most of the old writers talk about these being judgment, is not God creating the judgments, but it is demons who are creating or committing these retributive acts, if we call them that way, or these bad experiences. So he looks at these two, God is the revealer. He's opening to us what is to come, what is happening, and helping us understand how far we are down to the ending of time, and to bring about our preparation. And on the other hand, there is this one he calls a slanderer, or the accuser of the brethren, and he's the one committing many of the acts. And for example, back to Revelation 9:4, he says, God is saying, don't harm the trees or grass. So he is putting conditions. So he's providing conditions that they're not to do certain things. So there must be somebody or some group that he's telling, you can do your destructive work, but don't touch these. It brings me back to the whole idea of the story of the Exodus. If you remember the last day where they had to have this destroying angel to take the life of the firstborn. If you go back to Exodus, I think it may be Exodus 12 or 15, one of those two. When you read Exodus, when God says, okay, Pharaoh is going to allow you to leave because tonight I'm going to send a destroying angel, and the destroying angel will destroy all the firstborn. And then we believe that that destruction is God is going to destroy the firstborn. But then when we read in the same Exodus, we find God saying, the writer Moses saying, God does not allow the destroyer to come into the houses that had the blood and the lintel. He does not allow the destroyer to strike the occupants of the house. So we said God is destroying, but when you read that, it says somebody else is destroying, but God does not allow him to strike those who are in the house that have the blood on the doorpost. So I think we're seeing the same thing in Revelation 9:4.
Yeah.
You know, God is not the one doing the destruction of creating. He's
Mhm.
permitting, as Tongsa would say, he's permitting, but he's revealing what will happen. And at the same time, he has made avenues or he's made conditions to protect his own, you know, putting the blood of the lintel or the doorpost.
Mm.
So when the angel comes through, he will not destroy anybody in that house.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think so. The two views are pretty different one from another to a certain degree, but they both have positives to it, right? So this newer version, the positive there is yes, God is allowing things to occur, but He's still setting limits, right? Like He won't let it go beyond. So you can see that again in the plagues of Egypt. You see that with Job and other places, right? God kind of, okay, I'm going to allow so much, but nothing beyond this. So that's with the new idea. With the traditional idea, it's the idea that yes, Israel is kind of being punished here now by Satan. But the protection that they had, we now can have, right? So now we can have that protection that Israel used to have. So whichever way you end up accepting, right, as we go through these days, you'll find a positive on both ends. So so that's nice. That's good to know. So
So
Judy,
yes,
going
so
back.
can we say then that the third that was burnt up were those that were not sealed then? Because God said, do not touch.
Yeah, it's very possible, right?
Yeah.
So again, if you take the traditional view, so let's go back to like the Maxwell and things like that. This would be um, specifically talking about the Jewish nation here, right?
Right.
In which
Okay.
case, the next chapter would be talking about Christians by this point, right? Because they're the
Okay.
new children of God. If you
Right.
take the new idea, however, then it just simply means anyone throughout history that has the seal of God is this tree and this grass. So in that way, it is the same group, right? Anyone who's sealed by God is then appearing here in this trumpet and in the next chapter. So that one does slightly change depending on which view you then accept, right? But at the end of the day, again, for me the positive for me the important thing is to understand what the positive is. What is God trying to tell us? And I think Ken said it really well. This is about God letting us know that He's still in control, right? He's still setting boundaries. Yes, bad things are going to happen, but He's in control. He won't let it go beyond what is necessary or what He thinks is just.
Okay.
So for me, that's the highlight. For me, that's definitely what we should be focusing on. Any other final thoughts?
So
Go
I
ahead.
may say that these old views, like the views that Maxwell or Stefanovic or Pauline have on the first, at least the first two trumpets, that I still keep those at the back of my mind. I haven't thrown those out.
Yeah,
But all that you read, you have to keep them in mind.
absolutely.
And at the same time, you have to study for yourself. Ask God to guide you and study for yourself to understand.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense from Marvin Maxwell's view that this is God turning from the Jews because of the Jews neglecting to honor him by choosing, for example, the emperor, Caesar, then choosing God when Pilate asked them, here's a king. They said, no, that's not our king. Our king is Caesar. So that was retribution, because if you remember in the book of Daniel, it talks about the abomination of desolation. And when Jesus came, he reminded them that when you see the armies in Jerusalem, in the middle of Jerusalem or in Jerusalem, know that the desolation has come, which was really, he was talking about the fulfillment of that prophecy of Daniel 8. And when they, well, it's a long story, but when they did come, a lot of people left. They said even the apostles, like John, left and they went somewhere else because they knew that that was a sign Jesus actually gave them that these things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And, so it makes some sense as you read about the destruction of Jerusalem as the first trumpet, But, you have to keep it in mind, and you have to ask God to continue to help us to understand as we continue on in life and study of the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I completely agree with you what you said there at the beginning. That's why what we're doing here is very different than if we were doing like a revelation series,
Right,
for the public. When you do it
right.
for the public, you have to choose one and stick to it, and otherwise it gets too confusing. What
Yeah.
we're doing here is just studying the Bible, right?
Mhm.
So we're taking Revelation and looking at what the different theories are saying, right? Well, this makes sense because of this. This makes sense because of this. And then at the end of the day, all of us have to decide, right, which one we seem to focus on more. So that's why every week we'll be showing you the different ideas. That way you can at least understand why people have a different view, and then you can either accept it or you don't, right? So I think that's really important to, like Ken said, study, look at different views, and then compare them to see, okay, which one for me works better, right? Which one seems to make more sense? So yeah, that's the whole point of
Well, it's not
Wednesday.
even which one makes more sense. It is for me to go back and look at the Old Testament and
Mm,
see which key provides a better
yeah,
answer or the right answer.
yeah, yeah.
So whatever I'm reading in the book of Revelation, because the Old Testament has so much information to open up the book of Revelation to
Hmm.
our understanding, I must make sure that the Old Testament that I look at has the key
Yeah.
to unlock whatever it is saying in the book of Revelation. That's very important. And if it does, then I look at that and I keep that in mind as I go along.
Yeah. And that's why I'll always be trying to throw in other verses that seem to connect, right? If we
Yeah.
like when we talked about the third and things like that. So as we go through again Revelation, absolutely, the Old Testament is the key of Revelation. All right. That's why those people that don't read the Old Testament are completely lost when they read it, right? They just end up making whatever they want, and you end up with these books that make, ridiculous claims, because they're just taking ideas out of the air. You definitely have to use, the well, the whole Bible, I would say, even some parts of the New Testament, but use the Bible. That has to be the primary source. And then after that, I would say, you have to take history, right? So take historical events, take things that happened, and then based on everything that you can understand out of the Bible, okay, if there is a time frame here, where does it fit, right? And where are we within this? So yeah, absolutely. So that's what we're going to be trying to do as we go on. Sorry if this ends up being a little bit more confusing than maybe you hoped. I'm sure some of you came here wondering. Just tell me what it is. That's it. That's all I want to know. Right? A lot of revelation, we're still trying to figure it out. There's a lot of layers and studying that has to take place to really understand. Go ahead, Ken.
That's why I believe that we have to see the book of Revelation as God doing something for humankind, for his children. And he's not going to leave us. The Bible says when Jesus came, he says, I'm not going to leave you orphans. I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit, that I will always be with you. So that idea tells us that God is not going to leave his children, those who look to him, alone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the book of Revelation is telling us things that will come. And many of the things we find as very tragic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And those tragic experiences are very scary. And we think God is bringing about retribution. First, he has 7 seals, retribution, then 7 trumpets, more retribution, then 7 plagues, bowl of plagues. More. But God, that's not God, what God is like. From the
Yeah.
very beginning, the
Yeah.
Bible says when Adam and Eve sinned, God says, well, look, because you guys disobey me and sin, and you know the consequences is death, that's it for you.
Yeah.
The Bible says in Genesis 3:15, he provided a solution to the sin problem.
Yeah.
And then in addition, in Genesis 3:21, he provided a covering for them, which in a sense implies that God was going to do something about the sin problem, or else he would have destroyed them. And so we have to take into account that God is not the God who is destroying. God is a creator, and he's a redeemer. And we have, as we read the book of Revelation, that this revelation is God is revealing to us what is to come, that we will have a safeguard. We'll be acquainted with what is to come, and we can draw closer to him, look to him for the kind of protection and guidance we need as we go through our days.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely, right? And that's what we got to do. That's what we got to do. All right, let me stop recording here so that we